The cold doesn't warn you in Brooklyn. It doesn't creep in. It arrives. All at once, like a decision that's already been made. I felt it in my knuckles first, the hand gripping the suitcase handle, then in my chest, where the January air cut straight through a coat that had never been built for weather like this. My other hand was pressed flat against my belly. Not because I was afraid. Because it was the only warm thing left. I was standing on the sidewalk outside the only address I'd had for 3 years, and the door behind me was locked. I could still hear Pierce Maddox's voice through the glass. Not the words. The tone. The particular flatness of a man who has done this before and found it easy. You have until morning to remove the rest. I had argued. Of course I had. I knew the law. I had spent 2 years as a paralegal before my pregnancy made it impossible to keep the hours. I knew what a legitimate lease violation looked like, and I knew what this was. This was a piece of paper with my name on it, a fabricated clause, and a landlord who had already called someone at the city before he knocked on my door. The security guard had been almost apologetic, carrying my suitcases down the stairs one by one while I stood in the hallway and tried to decide whether to cry or fight. I chose neither. I stood straight, I kept my voice level, and I walked out with my head up. That was 40 minutes ago. Now I was standing in freezing rain with 2 suitcases, a phone at 4% battery, and 31 days until my due date. The windows of my building glowed amber above me. Neighbors were home. I knew their names. Mrs. Okafor on the 2nd floor had given me a baby shower last October, paper plates and balloons and a second-hand crib she'd painted white herself. None of the windows opened. No one came down. Brooklyn doesn't care if you're falling. It only cares if you're blocking the sidewalk. I pressed my hand harder against my belly and tried to think. Shelter. There was a church on Flatbush that kept their doors open. There was. My phone died. Just like that. Mid-thought. Screen went black. I stood there in the rain holding a dead phone, and for the first time in 8 months. Longer maybe since Marcus left, since the job ended, since the pile of things I could not control grew tall enough to block the light, I didn't know what to do next. Then I heard the engine. Low. Smooth. The kind of sound that doesn't belong on a street like this, the same way a cathedral doesn't belong next to a check-cashing place, and yet somehow commands the whole block the second it arrives. A black SUV rolled out of the rain and stopped at the curb. Not rushed. Not dramatic. The way something stops when it has never needed to hurry. The door opened. He stepped out. No umbrella. He didn't reach back for one, didn't flinch at the rain, didn't glance at the sky. He was Korean, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a dark navy suit that the weather simply refused to ruin. His face was angular and still, not blank but controlled, the way a room goes quiet not because it's empty but because someone with authority just walked in. He looked at me. Not the way men look at pregnant women on the street, that brief, sliding glance of discomfort, the calculation of whether they're obligated to help. He looked at me the way someone looks at a situation they are about to address. Then he looked past me. Through the glass door. At Pierce Maddox, still standing in the lit lobby with his arms crossed and his chin up. I watched Maddox's face change. It happened in stages. Recognition first. Then something underneath recognition, something older, something that lived in the body before the brain could manage it. His arms came uncrossed. His chin came down. His hand moved toward his phone and then stopped, because whatever calculation he ran, he already knew the answer. The man in the suit walked toward the building. He passed me without a word, not dismissively, but purposefully, the way you pass a piece of evidence you intend to come back to. He stopped at the glass door. He looked at Maddox through it. He spoke 4 words. Quiet. Almost conversational. Open it. Right now. Maddox opened the door. My name is Zola Kruma. I am 29 years old, 8 months pregnant, and I have spent my entire adult life learning not to need anyone. I had systems for everything. Backup plans for the backup plans. I knew how institutions worked and how to work within them, and when they failed me, which they did reliably, creatively, I knew how to rebuild without asking for a hand. I was very good at surviving alone. What I was not prepared for, what none of my systems had accounted for, was a man I had never met telling a man who had just destroyed my life to open the door. His name, I would learn later, was Go Tae-woo. Brooklyn's real estate networks called him a developer. The people who owed him money called him something else entirely. Pierce Maddox, standing in that lobby with his shoulders folded inward and his voice stripped of everything that had been in it an hour ago, had been expecting him. Just not tonight. Just not like this. Tae-woo hadn't come for me. I need to be clear about that. He had come to collect what Maddox owed him, and what Maddox owed had nothing to do with a pregnant woman on a sidewalk in January. But he saw me standing there. And something shifted. I didn't know yet what kind of world I was about to step into, or what it would cost me, or what it would ask of me in return. I didn't know that the man walking back toward me through the rain had not done an impulsive thing in 15 years, and that putting me in that car would be the first. All I knew was that he stopped in front of me, looked down at the suitcases, looked at my face and said, still quiet, still controlled, still utterly unbothered by the weather, "You're not staying out here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really an offer. I looked at the locked door behind me. I looked at my dead phone. I pressed my hand to my belly, where something small and alive shifted in response, as if it too was waiting on my answer. I picked up the suitcase. And I got in the car. 3 weeks before the eviction, I reorganized my kitchen cabinets. It sounds like nothing. But when you are 8 months pregnant and your lower back has stopped speaking to you in polite terms, getting down on your knees to rearrange canned goods and stack measuring cups by size is a declaration. It is a way of telling yourself, this is mine, this is ordered, this will hold. That was always how I operated. When things outside my control started multiplying, I found the things I could control and I managed them precisely. It was a system I had built over years, refined through losses I don't like to catalog, and it had never once let me down. I grew up in Crown Heights, 2 subway stops from that apartment. My mother worked hospital laundry for 22 years. My father left when I was 11. Not violently, not dramatically. He just became less present by degrees until one morning he wasn't there and we adjusted. That was the first time I understood that people you love can disappear without any single moment you can point to as the reason. I was good at school the way quiet children often are, not because it came easily, but because I understood early that credentials were a kind of armor. I got a paralegal certificate from CUNY at 23 and spent 4 years at a mid-sized firm in downtown Brooklyn that handled housing cases. Evictions, mostly. Which is to say I had sat across tables from people in exactly the situation I would find myself in, and I had helped build the paperwork that protected them. I knew the law. I knew the loopholes. I knew the difference between a legitimate lease violation and a pretext, and I knew that landlords like Pierce Maddox had been using pretexts in neighborhoods like mine for decades because the system made it easier to evict than to fight. I knew all of this. It did not save me. Marcus came into my life at 26 and left it at 28, which is a short window when you consider that somewhere in the middle of it I made the decision to build a future with him. He was not a bad man in any dramatic sense. He was simply someone who wanted a version of this life that did not include the version of me that was actually showing up, the long hours, the careful budgeting, the way I needed everything to have a plan. When I told him about the pregnancy, he listened to the whole thing, nodded, and said he needed some time to think. He took 6 months. By month 3 I had stopped waiting, rearranged the furniture so his absence didn't leave a shape in the room, and started researching single-parent resources with the same methodical focus I had applied to every other problem I'd been handed. I applied for 3 different assistance programs. 2 had wait lists measured in years. One informed me, after a 4-month review process, that I earned marginally too much to qualify, this being the version of me who had taken reduced hours at the firm when the pregnancy made the commute impossible, so my income had already dropped by 1/3. I did not fall apart. I recalculated. I took on remote document review work. I stretched my savings with a precision that would have impressed an accountant. I kept the apartment, $1,450 a month for a 1-bedroom in a building that needed work but was mine, that I had painted myself, that had a radiator that knocked every night at 2 a.m. in a rhythm I had learned to sleep through. I hung the curtains. I assembled the second-hand crib Mrs. Okafor gave me and sanded the one rough edge until it was smooth. I put a small library of children's books on the windowsill in order of the age I planned to read them to her. I didn't know that yet officially. I just knew. The thing about building a life entirely on your own terms, with no slack in the system and no one to call when something goes sideways, is that it works. Right up until it doesn't. Every contingency I had planned for was a contingency I could see coming. I had not planned for a landlord who decided, in the third year of my tenancy, that my building was worth more empty than occupied. I had not planned for a fabricated lease violation and a locksmith who arrived at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday while I was at a prenatal appointment. I came home to a notice taped to a door that already had a new key I didn't own. I spent 4 hours on the phone with the city's housing hotline, which put me on hold for 40 minutes and then disconnected. With a tenant advocacy organization that was, genuinely, doing its best with a caseload that had tripled since the pandemic. With a legal aid office that could schedule a consultation in 11 days. 11 days. I was 31 days from my due date. I sat on the floor outside my apartment door with my back against the wall and my hands on my belly, and I did not cry. I breathed. I thought. I made a list on my phone of every option I had left. By 11 p.m., I had worked through all of them. That was when I picked up my suitcases and walked outside into the rain. It started with a knock. 3 of them, deliberate and unhurried, the kind that already knows it has authority before the door opens. It was 7:40 in the evening. I had just gotten back from my prenatal appointment, shoes off, feet elevated on the couch cushion I'd positioned specifically for that purpose. I was eating rice and beans I'd made Sunday, enough for the week, portioned into containers in the refrigerator in the order I planned to eat them. Everything measured. Everything accounted for. I opened the door. Pierce Maddox was not alone. He had brought a man I didn't recognize, heavy-set, wearing a jacket with a property management logo I'd never seen on any correspondence. And he was holding a manila envelope the way people hold things they've already decided to deploy. He handed it to me before I could speak. I took it. I read it. It accused me of subletting the apartment without written consent, citing a clause in my lease that I had read 17 times over 3 years because I am the kind of person who reads leases 17 times. The clause existed. The violation did not. I told him this calmly. I used precise language. I cited the relevant section, explained what subletting legally required, and informed him that I had documentation of every person who had spent a night in this apartment since I signed the lease, which was no one except me and, for 8 months, a man whose name was also on the original application and who had therefore been explicitly permitted. Maddox listened with the patience of someone who had stopped listening before he knocked. The decision's been made, he said. You have until midnight to gather your essentials. Full vacancy by end of week. I asked him who had made the decision and under what legal authority. I asked for the name of the property management company on the jacket. I told him that what he was describing was an illegal lockout and that I intended to contact the city's housing enforcement office first thing in the morning. He nodded at the man beside him, who produced a key and held it up. Locks were changed at 9 this morning, Maddox said. Building maintenance issue. You'll need to collect your belongings tonight. That was the moment I understood. Not intellectually. I had understood intellectually from the first paragraph of the notice. This was the understanding that lives in the chest. The kind that makes your hands go still. He had done this before. He had the language memorized. He had brought the right person and the right paperwork, and he had changed the locks before I came home, which meant he had planned the sequence carefully, which meant there was nothing I could say in this doorway that he had not already accounted for and dismissed. I asked for 30 days written notice as required by New York state law for a tenant of more than 1 year. He said the subletting violation voided that provision. I said it did not. He said his attorneys disagreed. I stood there in my doorway, swollen, exhausted, 8 months pregnant, and I argued the law with a man who was not interested in the law. I argued it clearly and correctly. I cited case precedents. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. My hand found my belly the way it always does when I need something solid to hold on to, and I kept my eyes on his face, and I said every true and accurate thing I knew how to say. None of it mattered. The security guard appeared at 9 o'clock. Young, uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes with the practiced avoidance of someone following instructions he'd been told not to deviate from. He asked me what I needed help carrying. I told him I didn't need help. I carried the first suitcase down myself, slowly, one hand on the railing. He carried the second one without asking. It took 4 trips. My laptop, my files, my documents, the folder of lease paperwork and payment receipts I had kept in a fireproof box because I had always known that one day I might need to prove everything. The baby clothes I'd washed and folded and put in the dresser drawer in order of size. The children's books from the windowsill. I left the crib. I couldn't carry it alone, and I would not ask the security guard to help me dismantle the thing I had spent a Saturday afternoon assembling with my own hands, in my own home, for my daughter. I left it there. The rain started while I was on the second trip down. By the fourth it was steady, the kind that soaks through to the skin inside of a minute. My coat was not waterproof. My shoes were not waterproof. My suitcases darkened in patches where the water found them. I looked up at the building. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. Mrs. Okafor's apartment, light on, curtain shifted. A shape behind it. She had my phone number. She had given my daughter a crib. The curtain fell back into place. I looked at the other windows. Lit rectangles, the blue flicker of television screens, the shadows of people who were home and warm and present and who had done the calculation every bystander eventually does, the one where the cost of stepping in outweighs the cost of staying back. I did not blame them. I understood the calculation. I had run it myself, before I learned what it felt like to be on the other side of it. Maddox watched from the lobby doorway until I was fully on the sidewalk. Then he let the door close. I stood in the rain. I waited for the next thing I knew how to do. Nothing came. Go Tae-woo did not like to be kept waiting. It was not impatience. Impatience was emotional, and he had excised most of his emotions the way a surgeon removes something that has stopped being useful. It was precision. He operated on schedules that other people experienced as pressure, and he experienced as basic respect for the value of time. His time. Theirs. Everyone's. Pierce Maddox had been disrespecting that value for 4 months. The debt was not complicated. Maddox had borrowed infrastructure. Specifically, access to 3 of Tae-woo's shell companies for a redevelopment deal in Crown Heights that required the appearance of multiple independent investors. In exchange, he had promised a clean return and a clean exit by October. It was now January. The return had not materialized. The exit had not materialized. What had materialized instead were excuses, delivered through intermediaries, in language carefully chosen to imply that the delay was temporary and the situation was under control. Tae-woo's network had been telling him otherwise for 6 weeks. He had reviewed Maddox's property filings himself. Not because he enjoyed the work, but because he had learned over 15 years that the only analysis he fully trusted was his own. What he found was not a developer who had overextended in a difficult market. What he found was a pattern. Systematic. Deliberate. Lease violations that appeared suddenly on long-term tenants, always within 18 months of a rezoning application. Filings that cited clauses selectively. Money moving between LLCs in sequences designed to obscure who owned what and when. Maddox was not managing a cash flow problem. He was running a machine, and he had made the mistake of running it partially on Tae-woo's infrastructure without Tae-woo's knowledge or permission. That was the part that required a personal visit. The SUV turned onto the block at 11:14 p.m. Tae-woo was reviewing a document on his phone, not looking up, because he knew this neighborhood and he knew this building and he did not need to watch the approach. His head of security, a quiet man named Dae-young who had been with him for 9 years, would alert him when they arrived. What Dae-young said instead was, "There's a woman on the sidewalk." Tae-woo looked up. She was standing in the rain with 2 suitcases at her feet and one hand pressed to her stomach, which was the first thing he registered. The hand and what it meant, and the fact that she was 8 months pregnant at minimum standing outside in January at 11 o'clock at night. Her coat was soaked through. Her breath came in visible clouds. She was looking at the building with an expression he recognized not as despair but as something colder and more controlled than despair. She was thinking. Running through options. He could tell by the stillness of it, the way her eyes were moving even though the rest of her wasn't. The second thing he registered was the suitcases. The third thing was Pierce Maddox, visible through the lobby glass, watching her from inside with his arms crossed. Tae-woo looked at Maddox. Then at the woman. Then at the building, where he could count at least 4 lit windows and no open doors. He understood the complete picture in approximately 4 seconds. "Stop the car," he said. Dae-young stopped the car. Tae-woo stepped out. He had not planned to get out here. He had planned to have Dae-young call ahead, let Maddox sweat through a 5-minute wait, then enter with enough controlled presence to make the conversation short. That plan had assumed a clear sidewalk. The sidewalk was not clear. He looked at the woman. She had turned toward the SUV with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected arrivals at this hour rarely improved situations. Her eyes moved over him quickly, suit, car, number of doors that had opened, and he saw her recalibrate, though he couldn't yet tell in which direction. He did not speak to her. Not yet. He walked to the lobby door and looked at Maddox through the glass, and he said 4 words at a volume that was just sufficient for the glass to carry. Maddox opened the door. The conversation inside was brief. Tae-woo did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. He told Maddox that the debt was being called in full, that the shell company arrangements were being dissolved immediately and cleanly, and that the woman on the sidewalk would be returning to her apartment tonight. Maddox began to explain the lease violation. Tae-woo looked at him with an expression that caused Maddox to stop explaining. "She goes back inside," Tae-woo said. "Or everything you've built in this borough using my name gets taken apart in ways you won't see coming. Choose quickly." He walked back out without waiting for the answer. The answer was already determined. The woman was still standing where he'd left her. She had not moved toward the door. She had not moved toward the car. She was watching him with those same steady, calculating eyes, and he realized she was waiting to understand what she was being offered before she decided whether to take it. He respected that. More than he expected to. "You're not staying out here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the building. Then she picked up the suitcase, the heavier one he noticed without hesitation, and she walked to the car. He hadn't told her his name. He hadn't explained himself or the situation or what came next. In his experience, people either trusted the evidence in front of them or they didn't, and this woman had clearly decided that the evidence was sufficient. He found, as Dae-young pulled away from the curb, that he wanted to know how she'd made that calculation. He would ask her later. There were other things to handle first. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Cobble Hill that had no sign outside and no name on the intercom panel. Clean brick, maintained without being decorated. The elevator worked silently. The hallway smelled of nothing, which in Brooklyn is its own kind of luxury. Dae-young unlocked the door and stood aside. I walked in. It was not what I had expected. I don't know exactly what I had expected. Something that announced itself, maybe. Something that matched the SUV and the suit and the 4 words that had opened a locked door. Instead it was simply a good apartment. Hardwood floors, recently refinished. A kitchen with uncluttered counters and a working stove. A bedroom with a bed that had been made with the indifferent precision of a place that is kept ready but not lived in. A second smaller room, empty, that I stood in the doorway of for a moment without speaking. It would fit a crib. I did not say that out loud. I set my suitcase down by the door and turned around. Tae-woo had come in behind me and was standing near the kitchen island with his jacket still buttoned, as if he had not yet decided how long he was staying. Dae-young had remained in the hallway. The door was open. I noticed the door was open. I think he meant for me to notice. Sit down, he said, then added with slight recalibration. If you want to. He said. Not because he'd suggested it, but because my back had been making a specific argument for the last 3 hours that I was running out of grounds to contest. He remained standing. He looked at me with the same quality of attention he'd had on the sidewalk. Not invasive, but complete, the way someone looks when they are genuinely processing rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. Maddox owes me a significant amount, he said. Not money primarily. Infrastructure. Access he used without authorization for a development network he's been running through Crown Heights and 3 other neighborhoods. I've been building a case against the structure for 2 months. He paused. Tonight I came to make clear that the arrangement was over. Finding you on that sidewalk told me something about how he operates that I hadn't fully quantified yet. I looked at him. He does it regularly, I said. The fabricated violations. I was a paralegal. I've seen his filing patterns, or I did before my phone died. I have documentation going back to 2019. Lease terminations, rezoning applications, the timeline between them. It's not random. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation. How much documentation? Enough. I kept my voice even. But I want to understand what you're proposing before we discuss what I have. Because I got into that car in the rain at 11 p.m. and I still don't know your name. A pause. Brief. Gochtaivo. And what is it that you want from me, Mr. Go? He was quiet for a moment in the way that indicated he was choosing precision over speed. Your knowledge is useful. Your legal instincts are useful. You've been living inside the pattern Maddox created. You understand it from the ground level in a way that my analysts don't, because they're working from filings and you're working from experience. He looked at me steadily. In return, you stay here. Safe. Resourced. Medical coverage for the remainder of your pregnancy and after. Whatever you need. I let that sit in the room for a moment. And if I say no? Then Dae-Young drives you wherever you'd like to go tonight and I don't contact you again. I studied his face for the tell, the flicker of leverage being held back, the slight smile of someone who knows your options are limited. It wasn't there. He meant it, which made it more complicated, not less. I'm not interested in being useful, I said. That's not an arrangement, that's an acquisition. I was useful to the firm I worked for and they let me go when the hours became inconvenient. I was useful to my son's father and he left when the reality didn't match what he'd imagined. I have spent my entire life being useful to structures that dropped me when the calculation changed. I held his gaze. So I need you to tell me plainly what I am in this situation. Because if the answer is a pawn, someone you move and sacrifice when the position calls for it, then I need to know that now. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water from the tap, and set it on the counter near me without comment. Then he looked at me with something that, on another face, might have become something warmer, but on his simply became more direct. You're not a pawn, he said. Pawns are replaceable. The room was quiet. Rain against the window, the distant sound of the city doing what it always does regardless of what happens to any individual person within it. I reached for the water. It was not trust. I want to be clear about that. I had not arrived at trust and I was not naive enough to mistake a clean apartment and a precise answer for safety. But it was enough. Enough to stay the night. Enough to see what the morning looked like. Sometimes that is all a decision needs to be. I have always been able to read a household within the first 24 hours of being inside it. It's not intuition, it's observation, the same skill that made me good at my paralegal work. You learn to notice what people do instead of what they say, where they position themselves in a room, what they won't meet your eyes about. Tae-woo's household said almost nothing. And yet it was extraordinarily legible. Mrs. Cho arrived at 7 each morning, let herself in with her own key, and moved through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who has long since stopped needing to think about the work. She was in her 60s, small, with hands that were always doing something. She brought groceries without being asked, good ones, the kind calibrated to a pregnant woman's needs, which told me that someone had given her specific instructions. She left lunch covered on the counter on the days I forgot to eat. She never commented on my work, never asked questions, never lingered. But twice in the first week I looked up from my laptop to find a cup of ginger tea on the table beside me that I hadn't heard her place there. The security, Two men who rotated in 12-hour shifts, always positioned near the building entrance, were furniture. Polite furniture that occasionally held doors, but furniture nonetheless. They did not make conversation. They did not need to. And Tae-woo himself operated on a schedule so consistent it became, within days, a kind of architecture I could feel the shape of without seeing it directly. He arrived at the apartment every evening between 7 and 7:15. He reviewed whatever his team had prepared, made calls in Korean that I could hear through the wall as a low, measured cadence with no emotional variation, and left again by 9. He checked on me each visit with the same 3 questions. How was I feeling? Had I eaten? Did I need anything? And received my answers with the same focused attention he applied to everything, as if my responses were data points he was integrating into a larger model. It was, I told myself, a professional arrangement. Clean. Boundaried. I could work inside those boundaries. So I worked. The building had a fast, private internet connection, and I had my documentation folder and my laptop and 3 years of paralegal instincts that had nowhere else to go. I started with what I already knew, Maddox's filing on my unit, and I pulled the thread. The city's property records database is public, which most people don't realize. It is also dense and cross-referential and designed, whether intentionally or not, to discourage the kind of sustained lateral reading that reveals patterns. I had spent 4 years doing exactly that kind of reading. I knew where to look and what I was looking for, and how the language of fabricated violations differed from legitimate ones in ways subtle enough to pass a cursory review and obvious enough, once you knew the signature, to identify across dozens of cases. By the end of the 2nd day, I had found 11. By the end of the 4th, 23. By the end of the 1st week, I had mapped 37 units across 9 buildings in 4 Brooklyn neighborhoods, all showing the same sequence: long-term tenant, sudden lease violation citing an obscure clause, eviction or forced vacancy within 60 days, rezoning or renovation application filed within 90. The violations were not identical. Maddox was careful enough to vary the cited clauses, but the timing was a fingerprint. And underneath the evictions, moving between 4 LLCs with different registered agents and the same accountant, was money. City contracts for below-market housing development that had never produced below-market housing. Council discretionary funds allocated to a non-profit that shared an address with one of Maddox's shell companies. The accountant's name appeared in Tae-woo's own documentation of the infrastructure arrangement, which meant the network was larger than either of us had understood when we made our agreement in this kitchen 4 days ago. I printed everything I had, organized it into a sequence that told the story from first principles, and set it on the kitchen island the next evening at 7:10. Tae-woo came in, saw the stack, and looked at me. "Sit down," I said. "It's going to take a few minutes." He sat. I walked him through it. I did not editorialize or present it dramatically. I stated what each document showed, what it connected to, and what the cumulative picture meant in terms of both criminal exposure and the number of families that had been displaced to build it. I had marked the 37 units on a map of Brooklyn. The pattern was visible from across the room. When I finished, the apartment was quiet. Tae-woo looked at the map for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and it was different from the way he had looked at me before. Before, his attention had been evaluative, the focused assessment of someone determining utility. This was something else. Something that took me a moment to name because I had not seen it on his face. It was regard. Not warmth. Not yet, and maybe not ever. I did not know this man well enough to know what warmth looked like on him or whether he allowed it. But it was the particular quality of attention that one person gives another when they have revised their estimate significantly upward and are still in the process of recalibrating. "This took you a week," he said. "I had good records. And I was motivated." He nodded slowly, looking back at the map. "So was he," he said. "For much longer." He was quiet for another moment. "Then, how many families?" "At minimum, 41 units. Likely more that I haven't found yet." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and picked up the stack of documents with both hands. Carefully, the way you handle something that has just become important. He looked at me one more time with that recalibrated attention. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." He left at 9 o'clock as always. But that night, through the wall, the calls went on until well past midnight. It started as pressure. That was the only word I had for it at 2 in the morning on a Thursday. Not pain exactly, but a tightening that came in waves and didn't release the way it was supposed to. I had read enough about Braxton Hicks contractions to know the difference between practice and the real thing, and I had read enough about preterm labor to know that at 33 weeks, the distinction mattered enormously. I sat up in bed and waited through one wave. Then another. Then I looked at the clock and started counting the minutes between them. 7 minutes. Then 6. Then 6 again. I got up, which took longer than it should have, and I walked to the kitchen and drank a full glass of water because dehydration could cause contractions and I wanted to eliminate the simple explanation before I moved to the harder one. I stood at the counter in the dark and breathed and waited. 5 minutes. I knocked on the housekeeper's door. Her name was Mrs. Yoon, and she communicated primarily through action rather than language. Appearing with food when I hadn't eaten, removing dishes before I thought to clear them, adjusting the heat in my room without being asked. She opened her door within seconds, looked at my face, and already had her phone out. I told her not to call anyone dramatic. She called Dae-young. The hospital was 12 minutes away. I know this because I counted those minutes the same way I had counted the contractions, methodically, because method was the only thing I had that felt like control. The streets were empty and wet, Brooklyn at 3 in the morning belonging entirely to itself, and I sat in the back of the car with my hands flat on my knees and my eyes on the window, and I did not let myself think past the next necessary thing. Check in. Get monitored. Find out what was happening. Handle it. What was happening, the attending physician explained 3 hours later, was a combination of dehydration, stress, and cervical irritability that had produced genuine preterm contractions but had not, so far, progressed to active labor. My daughter's heart rate was strong and steady. They wanted to keep me for observation, administer fluids, monitor through the morning. If everything stabilized, I could leave the following evening. I said that was fine. I asked about the baby's positioning and the contraction frequency and what the threshold was for intervention, and the attending answered all of it with the patience of someone who had learned to recognize a patient who needed information the way other patients needed reassurance. I took notes on my phone. I asked him to repeat the medication name so I had the correct spelling. He left. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. My daughter's heartbeat filled the room like a small, determined argument, and I lay back against the pillow and closed my eyes and let myself, just for a moment, be completely exhausted. I don't know when Tae-woo arrived. I was asleep. What I know is that when I woke at 7 in the morning, Dae-young was standing in the corridor outside my room in the same position he occupied outside every room Tae-woo entered, present, peripheral, facing outward. Which meant Tae-woo was somewhere nearby. I found out later, from Mrs. Yoon who had accompanied me and who communicated more through expression than I had initially credited, that he had arrived at 4:30 a.m. That he had spoken to the attending physician in the corridor for approximately 3 minutes. That he had then sat in the chair outside my room for 2 hours while I slept, not reading, not on his phone, simply sitting in the way that people sit when they don't know what else to do with themselves in a place that operates outside their jurisdiction. He came in at 7:15. I was awake, eating the hospital breakfast I had requested because I was hungry and my daughter needed calories regardless of the circumstances. He stood inside the door for a moment in the particular way he had of occupying a space without announcing himself in it. He looked, for the first time since I had met him, uncertain. Not frightened. Not soft. Just, without his usual precise knowledge of what the correct next action was. It was a small thing. A barely perceptible absence of the quality that was otherwise always present in him. I noticed it the way you notice when a sound you've become accustomed to suddenly stops. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at the monitor, then at me. "She's fine," I said. "Both of us." He nodded once. He didn't say anything. I finished my breakfast. The monitor beeped. Outside the window, the city was beginning its morning, indifferent and continuous as always. He stayed. Not briefly. Not the duration of a status check or a courtesy visit or a meeting with a defined endpoint. He stayed through the shift change, through the second round of monitoring, through the physician's morning check which he listened to from the chair with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor. He answered a single phone call in a low voice and then put his phone away. At some point I fell back asleep. When I woke again he was still there, reading something on his phone now, jacket off for the first time, the formality slightly loosened in a way that felt less like a choice than an accumulated effect. I didn't say anything about it. But I noticed. I filed it carefully, in the part of myself that was still building the case. Not against him, not anymore. Just the case for what kind of person he actually was, underneath the precision and the controlled silences and the 4 words that opened locked doors. A person who showed up at 4:30 in the morning and stayed until he was sure. That was worth noting. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. I know the exact time because that was when Tae-woo's assistant, a composed woman named Ji-yeon who communicated with the efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with delivering bad news, sent it to my phone with no accompanying message. Just the link. Which told me everything about how bad it was before I opened it. The outlet was a local politics blog that orbited the city council the way certain organisms orbit larger bodies, feeding on proximity, mistaking access for credibility. It had enough readership to matter and not enough editorial standards to slow down a story that arrived pre-packaged and ready to print. The headline called me a fraudulent tenant. The subheading mentioned a criminal record. The body of the piece cited 2 anonymous sources close to the city's housing enforcement office and included a quote from a spokesperson for a tenant advocacy organization I had never contacted, who had apparently been informed that I was a known bad actor who had cycled through 3 Brooklyn apartments in 4 years using the same scheme. Every sentence was precisely constructed to be difficult to disprove quickly. That was the sophistication of it. Not outright fabrication. Fabrication could be addressed directly. This was selective truth, arranged maliciously. I had moved 3 times in 4 years. That was real. And it had happened because 2 of those buildings had been sold to developers who made the rent untenable. My criminal record consisted of an arrest at 22 during a tenant protest outside a Crown Heights building, charges that were dropped within 48 hours and expunged within the year. Real. Ancient. Irrelevant. And now resurrected and placed in a paragraph next to the word fraudulent, so the reader's brain would do Maddox's work for him. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. He had not retreated. He had calculated that retreat was more dangerous than escalation, which meant he was more afraid of Tae-woo than I had understood, and that fear had made him reckless in a direction I should have anticipated. I was the softer target. I was the variable he could attack without directly engaging what he actually owed. I picked the phone back up and started building a rebuttal document. Tae-woo arrived at 9. He did not knock. He had not knocked since the 3rd day, and I had stopped expecting it the way you stop expecting certain formalities once a situation has moved past them. He came into the kitchen, looked at the document open on my laptop, and looked at me. "I've seen it," I said. Ji-yeon is tracking the pickup rate. 3 other outlets have linked it so far. He set his phone on the counter. My network is asking me to distance the arrangement from my public interests. I kept my eyes on the screen. And are you going to? The question was direct because I needed a direct answer, and because I had learned in 7 weeks that Tae-woo responded to directness the way most people responded to courtesy, with something that was almost relief. "No," he said. I looked at him then. He was already reaching for his phone. He made a single call in Korean that lasted less than 2 minutes. His tone throughout was level and final, the tone of someone closing a discussion that others believed was still open. He hung up and looked at me with the particular expression he wore when a decision had been made and he was already thinking past it. "What did you just do?" I asked. "There's a property consortium meeting tomorrow. 43 developers, 6 city council members, the deputy housing commissioner. I attend annually." He straightened his cuffs in the small habitual way he had that I'd noticed meant he was preparing for something. "I'll be making a statement before the formal agenda, clarifying your status as someone under my direct personal protection and identifying the current press narrative as what it is. A targeted smear originating from a party with significant legal exposure." I was quiet for a moment. That's going to raise questions about why you're protecting me. Yes. Questions you'll have to answer in ways that connect us publicly, permanently. Yes. I understood what he was offering and what it cost. In his world, public statements of personal protection were not procedural. They were declarations with weight and consequence, the kind that reorganized how every other player in the network understood your priorities. He was not just defending my credibility. He was attaching his to mine, which meant that anything Maddox did to me going forward would be received by every party in that room as something done to Tae-woo directly. It was the most protected I had been since this started. It was also, I understood clearly, the most exposed. You know this accelerates everything, I said. Once you make that statement, Maddox will know the timeline moved up. He'll move faster. I know. Then we need to be ready to move faster too. I turned the laptop toward him. The rebuttal document was 12 pages. Cross-referenced. Sourced. Sit down, I said. I want to walk you through what I have, and I want to decide together what we file first and where. He sat down. It was the first time I had said together and meant it without reservation, and if he noticed the shift, he was careful enough not to mark it. He simply pulled the laptop closer and began to read, and I began to talk, and outside the window Brooklyn went about its business entirely unaware that in a kitchen in Cobble Hill, the shape of what came next was being decided by two people who had arrived at trust by the longest, most unplanned route imaginable. The hearing room smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee and the particular staleness of a space where consequential things rarely actually happened. Room 412 of the municipal building seated 60. By 9 a.m. it held 47 people, which I knew because I counted them the way I had learned to count everything. Not from anxiety, but from the understanding that knowing your room is the first condition of working it. Maddox was already seated at the respondents' table when I came in. He had brought 2 attorneys and a binder that was thick enough to suggest confidence and color-tabbed enough to suggest preparation. He was wearing a suit that cost considerably more than anything in this room deserved and speaking to the council member on his left with the easy familiarity of a man who had been in this building many times and always left the way he came in. He looked up when I entered. I watched him recalibrate. I had become familiar with this expression over the past weeks. The moment when someone who has built a narrative about you encounters the actual version and has to decide how quickly to adjust. He had been expecting the woman from the sidewalk. Soaked coat, frightened eyes, 8 months pregnant and off balance. The story required that woman. The story required her to be exactly what his press plant had described. Unreliable, desperate, without standing. I was 35 weeks pregnant, yes. I moved carefully and my back announced itself on stairs. But I was wearing a dark blazer I had borrowed from Ji-Yun. My documentation was organized across 4 tabbed folders that mirrored the structure of my testimony, and I had spent the previous 48 hours doing what I had been trained to do, building an argument that could not be easily dismantled, because I had already anticipated every dismantling and addressed it in advance. I sat down. I arranged my folders. I poured water from the pitcher on the table and drank it steadily. The committee chair opened the session. Standard language, procedural framing, the administrative architecture that exists to make what happens inside it feel orderly. I had sat through hundreds of these as a paralegal. I understood the rhythm. I waited for my name. When it came, I stood, carefully, one hand briefly on the table, and I began. I did not begin with my eviction. I began with a map. Specifically, a documented timeline I had assembled from public filings, cross-referenced against rezoning applications submitted to the city between 2019 and the present day, showing 37 properties across 4 Brooklyn neighborhoods in which lease terminations citing identical or near-identical violation clauses had preceded development applications by an average of 11 months. I had printed it large enough to be visible from the committee bench. I had brought 7 copies. I walked them through it the way I had walked attorneys through case evidence for 4 years, methodically, without editorializing, letting the pattern make the argument because the pattern was unambiguous and I knew that unambiguous evidence, presented without drama, was harder to dismiss than any amount of passionate testimony. Maddox's lead attorney interrupted twice in the first 10 minutes. The first time to question my standing as a witness. I cited the relevant provision that granted standing to any party with documented direct impact from the conduct under review. The second time to challenge my sourcing. I provided the filing reference numbers and invited the committee to pull them independently, which I had already arranged with the clerk's office the previous afternoon. The attorney stopped interrupting. Maddox himself leaned over at one point and said something to his counsel in a voice calibrated to be just audible. A tactic I recognized, designed to suggest that what I was saying was easily answered even if the answer wasn't forthcoming yet. I did not look at him. I continued with the kickback documentation, which was the section I had spent the most time on and the section I was most certain about, because the money movement was recorded and records did not misremember. I was 40 minutes into my testimony when I heard the back door of the room open. I did not look up. I knew from the change in the room's quality of attention, the subtle collective shift of people becoming aware of a new presence without being certain why, that I didn't need to. But Maddox looked. I was watching him when he did it, and I saw the exact moment his confidence changed its nature. Not collapsed. Maddox was too practiced for collapse. But it became something maintained rather than something felt, which is a different thing entirely. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the back of the room to his attorney and back again, and the calculation running behind them was visible in the way that calculations become visible when the variables have suddenly changed. I didn't turn around. I knew what was there. Two men in dark suits, and between them a man in charcoal who had said, when I asked him this morning whether he was coming, simply, "I'll be in the back." He had not spoken. He had not needed to. His presence in that room meant that everything Maddox said today, every countermove he attempted, every ally he called on afterward, all of it would be received by every person in this building as a move made against Go Tae-woo directly. Maddox understood this. I could see him understanding it. I turned back to the committee. The final section of my documentation, I said, my voice steady and clear in the silent room, concerns the 3 shell companies used to obscure the beneficial ownership of 11 of these 37 properties. I have the registration records, the transfer history, and the names. I opened the last folder. I'd like to begin with the earliest. Pierce Maddox was arrested on a Friday morning, 11 days after the hearing. I know because Ji-Yun sent me the news alert at 7:52 a.m. with the same absence of accompanying message she had used for the article that started everything. Just the link. Which I had learned by now was her version of economy, not coldness. This time I read it once, set the phone down, and sat quietly for a moment with my hands on my belly. My daughter moved. A slow rolling shift that had become familiar over the past weeks. Her particular way of registering that something had changed in the atmosphere around her, that the body she lived in had released something it had been carrying. "I know," I said aloud to her, to the quiet apartment, to no one. "Me too." The families took longer. That was the part the news alerts didn't follow, the administrative machinery of returning people to homes that had been filed against, misdocumented, and legally complicated by months of Maddox's paper architecture. I spent 3 weeks after the hearing working with a housing attorney the tenant advocacy organization provided, untangling the filing history property by property. It was detailed, slow, often frustrating work, and it was the most useful I had felt in years, which is not a small thing to say. 11 families returned to their apartments before my daughter decided she was done waiting. She arrived on a Tuesday, 5 days before her due date, with the same efficiency she had demonstrated throughout. No prolonged warning, no false starts, just a clear and unambiguous signal at 4 in the morning that the timeline had moved up and we were doing this now. The hospital was the same one I had been monitored in 6 weeks earlier. The room was private. No one asked me about insurance in a tone that contained a threat. She was born at 9:17 a.m. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She cried immediately and with considerable conviction, which the nurse said was excellent, and which I recognized as a personality trait I would be navigating for the foreseeable future. I named her Ada. I had known this for months. Tae-woo arrived at noon. He came in quietly, which was his only mode, and stopped just inside the door the way he always stopped, assessing, orienting, determining the correct way to proceed. I was sitting up in bed. Ada was asleep in the bassinet beside me, swaddled with the imprecision of a newborn who has not yet learned to stay where she's been placed. He looked at her for a long moment. "You can hold her," I said. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not the controlled uncertainty from the hospital corridor 6 weeks ago, but something more unguarded than that. Something that acknowledged, without language, that he was about to do something he did not know how to do, and that this fact was not something he could manage his way around. He lifted her with careful, deliberate hands, the way someone handles something genuinely irreplaceable. He stood very still. Ada, who had been asleep, opened her eyes briefly, dark and unfocused, taking in whatever newborns take in, and then closed them again, entirely unbothered by the person holding her, which seemed to undo him more than her attention would have. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. He did not speak for a while, and I did not fill the silence, because I had learned that his silences were not empty. "Her name was Su-Yun," he said eventually. His voice was level but quieter than usual, the way voices go when they are carrying something old. "She was my sister. Younger by 4 years." He looked at Ada's face. "She died when I was 26. An accident that wasn't an accident. It was related to work I was doing then, people I was connected to. She had nothing to do with any of it." He paused. "She was the last person I let matter in a way I couldn't control." The room was very quiet. Outside the window the city continued, February light flat and pale against the glass. "After that," he said, "I built systems. For everything. Because systems don't grieve and they don't leave and they don't get used against you." He looked up from Ada to me. "You were supposed to be a system. A practical arrangement with defined parameters and a clear endpoint." I looked at him, this precise, controlled, carefully constructed man sitting in a hospital chair holding my daughter like she was the most important variable he had ever been trusted with. "She would have liked that you stayed," I said. "Su-Yun. The hospital, the hearing, all of it. She would have liked that about you." He was quiet for a long moment. Something in his face moved, not breaking, not dissolving, but shifting, the way a structure changes when the load it was built to resist finally, slowly, begins to be set down. He looked back at Ada. She made the small unconscious sound that newborns make, the one that means nothing and everything, and his arms adjusted around her instinctively, without calculation. He did not say anything else. He didn't need to. I had spent enough time learning to read his silences to understand what this one meant, that he had arrived at the edge of the system he had built and was choosing, for the first time in 15 years, not to retreat behind it. He stayed through the afternoon, through the evening, through the city going dark outside the window and Ada waking and sleeping and waking again in the cycles that would reorganize every hour of my life going forward. When the night nurse came in at 10, Tae-woo was still in the chair. His jacket was off. His phone was face down on the windowsill. He was watching my daughter sleep with the focused, wondering attention of someone encountering something they had no existing category for. I closed my eyes. For the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I did not run through the contingencies before I slept. I did not make a list. I did not calculate the distance between where I was and where I needed to be. I was already there. The community center on Fulton Street smelled of burnt coffee and folding chairs and the particular kind of hope that arrives not with fanfare but with people who had nowhere better to be and had decided that showing up was better than not. Zola had counted them twice. 19. She always counted, old habit, the same one that had kept her rent receipts in a fireproof box and her lease memorized to the clause level. The details other people overlooked were the ones that eventually decided everything. She had learned this the hard way, and the hard way was the only school that had ever truly taught her anything. Ada was 8 weeks old and home with Mrs. Cho. The tether between them stretched across Brooklyn like something physical. Not pain, not worry, more like the awareness of a second heartbeat she had grown so accustomed to carrying that its absence was its own kind of presence. She pressed her hand once to her coat, an old reflex, then set both hands flat on the table and looked at the room. A woman in her 50s with a housing notice still folded in her coat pocket. 2 young men sitting close in the way people sit when the world has taught them to take up less space than they deserve. An elderly man, Mr. Estime, who had introduced himself with the careful formality of someone who understood that names were a form of dignity, holding a plastic folder against his chest the way you hold something you have learned, through loss, never to put down. A teenager in the back row pretending to look at her phone. Zola had been every single one of them. "I want to start," she said, "by telling you something nobody told me when I needed to hear it. Knowing your rights and being protected by your rights are two different things. The gap between them is real. It is not a flaw in the system. In many cases it is the system working exactly as designed, for someone, just not for you." She paused. The room settled into itself. "I am not going to pretend that gap does not exist. What I am going to tell you is this: understanding it precisely, where it is, how it was built, who profits from your not knowing it is there, is the beginning of being able to cross it." Mr. Estime opened his folder and smoothed the top page with one slow, careful hand. Something in the gesture moved through Zola's chest like a key turning. He already knew. He had always known. He had simply never been in a room where someone confirmed that the knowing was correct. She had not planned what she said next. It arrived the way true things sometimes do, without warning, fully formed. "The night I was evicted, I stood in my doorway and argued the law with a man who had stopped listening before he knocked. I cited precedents. I kept my voice level. I said every accurate thing I knew how to say, and none of it mattered, because he had not come to be persuaded. He had come to execute a decision already made." She let that land. "I tell you this not to discourage you, but because I spent years believing that if I was right enough, prepared enough, the system would respond correctly. Preparation is not a guarantee. It is armor. And armor is what you wear when you know a fight is coming. Not because it makes you invincible, but because it is better than walking in without it." The teenager had put her phone away. "Armor, in practice, looks like this," Zola said. "A folder. Every lease. Every rent receipt. Every written message from your landlord. The date and content of every conversation you can remember, written down the same day it happens. Not because you are paranoid, because every institution that touches your housing is documenting you from the moment you sign. Parity is not paranoia. It is the same tool they use, available to you for the cost of a folder and the discipline to maintain it." She talked about patterns, how 41 families had been displaced not through any single dramatic act but through a sequence so deliberate and so mundane it had operated invisibly for years, until someone read 37 case files side by side and the fingerprint became impossible to deny. Injustice, she told them, rarely announces itself. It files paperwork. It changes locks during prenatal appointments. It relies on no single act being obviously criminal and on no one being patient enough to read the whole sequence. Pattern recognition is not a gift. It is a practice, and it begins with paying attention. She talked about help, how she had confused accepting it with surrendering independence for most of her adult life, how it had taken standing in the rain at 11 o'clock with a 4% battery before she understood that receiving a key is not the same as handing one over. That there are people and structures built specifically for the situation you are in, and using them is not failure. It is the same move your landlord makes when he calls his attorney before he knocks on your door. He has a team. You are allowed to have one too. Afterward, Tae-woo walked with her to the car without speaking. His version of presence, which she had long since learned to read as its own language. "You gave them what you had to build yourself," he said. "Yes. That is not a small thing." She looked at the street, at Brooklyn going about its permanent indifferent evening, at the lit windows of people who were home and warm and entirely unaware that in a community center on Fulton Street, 19 people had just been handed something that systems and landlords and locked doors had tried and failed to keep from them. "No," she said. "It is not."